so much.
My pleasure.
For being on the show. And what I wanted to do is, first I wanted to introduce you, why I decided to have you on this particular podcast. And the biggest reason for that is you are someone who's been there and done that when it comes to living in foster care, and then now you're doing the work that you do to help benefit a lot of the people that you might have seen as being yourself and some of the other siblings that went through a lot of the struggles and pain points. So with that said, I wanted to give you a brief time to introduce yourself and the work that you're doing and how that's impacting some of the local community here in Philadelphia.
Sure. As you said, I was in foster care and went into foster care at the age of 5. My mother passed away from a cranial aneurysm, and she had 12 kids. 10 of them were still living with her. 2 were old enough to be on their own. So those 10 that were living with her had to go into foster care because there was no one that was able to take care of them. And you just have to imagine a phone call being made that your sister passed away, and her 10 kids, and are you willing to take 10 kids? And I'm sure no one was that crazy. So we were divided basically 2 each to foster homes and group homes. And I spent the next 13 years in foster homes and in group homes before aging out of the system at 18. And always wanted to have an impact, and being in care, I always say, if I could run the show,
things would be better.
It'd be a lot better. So worked to do that, and eventually opened up Child First Services, and have been doing this job for the last 25 years as the CEO and president. And we primarily run group homes for youngsters. Generally, there are 6 kids in each group home, and they're majority of them are teenagers. We do have kids as young, in our Mother Baby program, as young as 2 months old, and in our other programs where the kids are young adults are 21. So we have 21 group homes that span 175 miles on the eastern side of the state of Pennsylvania, and again, trying to provide individualized support in those small group homes to help kids get over the challenges of being in foster care.
It's very interesting that you say that. I mean, it's obviously quite the operation that you've grown over the years, and I'm sure it did take years, and the struggles and all the things that you had to get to have that many group homes to begin with. I want to jump back and actually explore a little bit. When did you first have this idea that, okay, this is what needs to be built? And then the second part is, how did you develop that confidence within yourself, saying, no matter what other opinion I receive along the way, I'm still going to continue on with this goal of building this facility?
Sure. It was really the work of a Catholic nun who was the executive director of the agency that I was in. It's an agency in Rockland County outside of New York called St. Dominic's Home. And I was sitting on the steps of her office, and she comes walking out and says, "Nat, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be on the playground." And I said, "Well, my brothers and sisters were supposed to come visit today, but their vehicle broke down and they're not coming." So I think she could see that I was a little bit sad. She said, "Sit there for a minute. I'm going to go and I'm going to come back." And because it was a large campus with several hundred kids, we had a storeroom. And so she went downstairs to the storeroom, and she had to be in her early 60s, and she carried up this bicycle, probably 25, 30 steps, to give it to me. So I thanked her very much, and then took the bicycle, went back to the cottage, and said, "Everybody, I got a new bicycle." And they started asking me to ride it. And one of my housemates was riding the bicycle down the driveway, and that's when it dawned on me. If I wasn't careful, that was going to be the story of the rest of my life, telling a sad story and waiting for a handout. But I really liked what Sister Mary Patrick did. She saw a problem and she solved it. And that was the day in which I recognized that that's what I wanted to be. I didn't want to be a Catholic nun, but I wanted to be the executive director. I wanted to be the person who was able to make things happen for children. And so I started at 12 years old, signing my name, Nathaniel J. Williams, Executive Director. It took me another 12 years for that to be my title, but it's been my title ever since. So that was the day I realized by that gift, it was a gift of a bicycle, but so much more than that. That gave me some clarity that's what I wanted to do. So I think as going back to your second question is, that was where the confidence came from. This Sister Mary Patrick was probably the kindest person, and now that I know what I know, probably the least likely person to be the executive director. She just had no, mean bone in her body, and I think was trying to make everybody happy. And but that quality was what made a difference to me, that she cared when she didn't really have to, and she wanted to impact and wanted to use the resources of the agency to make things better. And this agency was built on orphans, and there's probably 200 kids there, and me and another kid were probably the only orphans. And this is in the early to the late 70s, early 80s, that even orphanages at that point were not for orphans. They were for kids that had families who were not able to care for them.
Temporary housing.
Right. And so one of the things that people always say to me is that, oh, Nat, you understand these kids and what they're going through. They're going through something a little different than what I did. My mom was dead, and there's nothing I can do. My father was unknown and is not even listed on my birth certificate. These children that we find are being supported by agencies today have living, breathing mothers and fathers who have often chosen or been led down a path that has pulled them away from their child. And that's a different kind of pain than when you have someone that can never come back. Again, I think that my story is part of what has built the foster care system, but I think the story has changed in a sense that often there are resources that the children have that are just not available to them, and I think there's a different kind of frustration that children have because of wanting something that's so close but often so far.
Back in the day when you were going through the foster care system with a lot of the siblings, based on what I've read, who paved the way within kind of your family of those children, as far as, okay, this is how long we may want to stay, this is how to get out, this is what to do when you get out? Would you say that you were one of the ones that took on that role, or is there someone else that inspired you?
I have an older brother, Michael, and he was, I think, in his teens at the point my mom passed away, and his goal was always trying to pull the family together and to keep that sense of connectedness. So I think in the family he represented that glue that was trying to keep it together. But one of the things that I also recognize in reflecting back on those years is that often we feel that we're forsaken as foster kids, but I've realized that sometimes we're stupid in not realizing that the provision is always there. It's just we're looking for one person to do it.
Yeah.
And it's a multitude of people.
Yeah.
And then going back and thinking about my behavior, it probably was too much for just one person to deal with. So
absolutely.
People had to take shifts being able to tolerate Nat Williams. So I think that's part of it, is that it's just the model that we have. We think we're supposed to have a traditional model, but I think life has told us over and over again our model is totally different. But we keep wanting to look at what other people have and recognize we don't have that. So I think that throughout my life I could always find a different person where one person stopped, another person began. But again, I was looking for one person to rise up to replace my mother, and that just was not going to be not going to be the case.
It's interesting that you mentioned the fact that dealing with different behaviors in circumstances like that. I remember when I first came to the States, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that I didn't really speak any English to begin with. The words I knew were hi, how are you, yes and no, which is really not enough to take you anywhere at that time. So a lot of the behaviors I experienced were just emotions because of misunderstanding. I felt like I might have had an idea of what my parents were trying to say, but I couldn't respond to them fast enough. So you bring up a good point with having so many different people in your life play a role, which firmly made me believe that every single person is of value and has a story that's unique to this world. And so from that point on, it made me realize that it doesn't make sense to put people on a pedestal and look at them any differently, but rather look at them and say, okay, this person has become a celebrity because of hard work or because of connections or because of other factors. This person is striving towards this, and these are the things that make up their work ethic and their mindset and all those things. So it's good that you bring that up, because I think it does make you well-rounded and more down to earth when it comes to human relationships.
No question about it.
I want to jump into today's topic, and that is dealing with traumatic experiences. And the question I have for you is, when did you first recognize the type of impact that trauma has had on your life?
Sure. It was pretty real early on, and just when you listen to other people's stories and you try to reconcile them to your story, you realize that my story sometimes was more traumatic and more challenging than others. So that was the beginning of just often trying to find someone else who had a similar experience, and mine was somewhat of a challenge. But one of the things that we've learned later in life is that there are probably about, we have a list of 74 different traumatic experiences that people can have. And that what we find in working with foster kids, that most of their experiences happen earlier on in life, where for other people, it happens later.
Mm-hmm.
So they experience death and drug addiction and name calling and bullying and some of the other things that some people experience later. It's front loaded for foster kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we now understand is that most people are going to go through these. It's just when. And I think we have to do a better job as a society letting people know, here's the list of bad things that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So be on notice and be thankful when they happen later, when you're most likely able to developmentally to deal with them. But be on notice, they're coming. And so, you may have, you see that on the list that, a fire. Well, you may have not experienced that when you're young, but you go camping and you do something wrong and bingo, you have a fire bigger than life. So you had it later. Some individuals, experienced that earlier on, and that's the reason why they're in foster care, is their house burned down.
Yeah.
And there is no other. So I think part of it is the awareness of that life is full of a lot of traumatic events, and that if you're someone that is blessed with not having so many of them, be thankful, but just be aware that they may happen just a little bit later in a different time frame. So I think that's part of it, is that I think we try to live a life where we don't expect it. And again, we try to share that list of challenging life events with people, just to say, be on notice. These are the kind of things that can happen. And more importantly, these are the kind of things that you can do to help yourself deal with them a little differently. So just one example is that we've looked at friends, and there was some research I read years ago that talked about your 5 closest friends are often going to be an indicator of how successful you're going to be. And for many years I would share that information. And then it dawned on me, maybe about 2 months ago, that my 5 closest friends are not people, they're behaviors. And their behaviors of what we call is water me, which is H2O-ME, which is humor, humility, optimism, mindfulness, and empowerment. And that if I walk with those 5 friends, that's going to make a world of difference. And also from a spiritual standpoint, people often ask is, how is your higher power with you? Well, that's how he's with me, with humor, humility, optimism, mindfulness, and empowerment. And if I walk through those events, those traumatic events that happen, with that as my 5 closest friends, and stop looking for physical people. But even if I look for physical people, I'm looking for those 5 qualities in those physical people, it begins to change the game. And on the other side of that, we have an acronym called GRABS, that often we find ourselves with our 5 closest friends who are grandiose, raging, arrogant, blind, and selfish. So as opposed to the 5 qualities that we're supposed to be looking for, our 5 closest friends, we often get those people and places and things that want to grab from us. And as we deal with trauma, and trying to deal with trauma with grandiosity, raging, arrogance, blindness, and selfishness, it makes it even worse. So I think for us, it's often we're just one understanding away from success, and that's why fellowship and the sense of community is so important. And one of the challenges of growing up in the foster care system is that you're so used to very transient relationships. And you need a steady as you go kind of support. And I think our often foster children and their trauma is more exaggerated, is because they're stopping and going and picking up
so many transitions,
so that there isn't that continuity between that. But again, I think that keeping those 5 closest friends with you, that allows you to go through those circumstances no matter who you run into, and to be able to determine whether this is a good person, place, or thing for me based on whether or not those things are things that are present in the environment. So trauma is going to happen. It's just that we can do a better job of letting people know and being aware that this is what they look like, and then more importantly, how do you deal with them, and ways in which to cope with the circumstance.
Are there traumatic experiences that you still deal with, and
Sure.
if so, how do you deal with a lot of them, and what steps may you have for some other people?
So, if those traumatic events are given to your life, they're never leaving you. It will always be a residue, but that's what you want it to be. You want it to be a residue as opposed to something that consumes you. So I will always be an orphan. I will always be a person who's lost his mom at age 5. I will always be, someone who has had challenges with self-esteem. That will always be who I am. And I think often we try to erase it, but it was given to us, I believe, as an assignment to show people that it can be overcome. So I think that's the piece where I think people make a big mistake is they just want to, like, it goes away. That's what makes you, who
Human.
you are, and
Yeah.
that's what makes you who I am. It's that unique experience is part of what makes you special. So I encourage people to figure out a way to make it work for you, and to figure out a way that you can help it work for other people. So one of the things that I see with foster kids is on a given day there's 400,000 to 500,000 children in foster care, which if you look at it numbers wise, and who comes in and leaves in a year's time is about 800,000. That would make them the 13th largest city in the United States. But when I go out and I try to find people to work with the children, they're not foster kids. So I think when I looked at a study recently, there are 13 million out of 350 million people who have had experience in the foster care system. When I go out and I look for people to come in and do this work, I don't know where the 13 million are. And I think part of the trauma is you want to run away from it. But who better to begin to understand? So when you look at foster parents and adoptive parents, often they're not people, they're not of the 13 million. And part of our challenge is to let people know this experience you had it's not something you should run away from. You should run to it. You've been given an awareness and a knowledge about circumstances that others don't have, and really try to find a way to make it work for you. So I think part of the understanding of trauma, it happens to everyone. We all have different ways in which we respond to it, but it's something you're not going to go through life not having it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like what you said about the fact that, it's one of those things where it's part of life, and I think somehow making it not necessarily even into your advantage, but more so recognizing that these are the things that happen to me. What do I do about them? One of the things that I've learned, actually, as I was flying into Philadelphia, I was on a plane. I was on a $32 flight coming to Philadelphia, and I was sitting next to a baby, the only baby on the plane, just FYI. And the whole 2 hour, out of the 2 hours, I want to say about an hour and 40 minutes, an hour and 30 minutes, the baby kept crying. And so for me, once I heard that, in my mind I was like, okay, it's going to be this type of flight, but hey, what do I do with this? So I just sat back and relaxed and meditated, and one of the things I started doing was I started writing kind of my story in a way that I can tell other people, and that is, I've lived a life, to my knowledge, that has been authentic as far as, I don't hide things. I tell it as is, because I think that's how you can allow other people to understand that your experiences matter and your experiences are unique, and it's, I think, our job as people that once we get to that point to tell that story, and then from there to encourage other people. And I know that within this field, especially foster care and adoption, you bring up a good point with having such a small percentage of the bigger pie being those that have been in the system. And you said, okay, it's not like I can go out in the street and say, who is the former foster youth that we're looking for people to hire. You have to seek them out. And I think what ends up drawing and building a lot of this community is that story, is empowering people to tell their story. So with that, How did you start telling your story?
It really was by invitation that someone said, "Hey, this is something that people need to hear about." And so one of the things that someone pointed out is that I've written about 11 or 12 books, but never about my story. It really was about lessons learned on that journey that people would call my story. Hopefully one day I'll sit down and actually write this story. But I want to, when you start getting older, you start realizing that you're not done yet. So if I hold off writing the story, I realize I have more time. So it is part of self-soothing behavior. But I think that when you start sharing the story and you realize, whether verbally or in writing, that it gives you perspective. And again, I thought I had it pretty bad until I hear some other people's stories and what that looked like. So I think that when people do invite you to share your story, whether it's just one-on-one or with a group, it's important that you seize that opportunity, because again, that circumstance was given to you as a gift. People say to me, "You're telling me your mother died." Yeah, yes, she died, and because she died and I did something with it, we've impacted her.
Right.
Death has impacted thousands and thousands of other people that she will never meet. So this agency is here because of her death. And so we have to take those circumstances that could be perceived as trauma and figure out a way, how do I make this work for me, but also for other people, and share that story, because often in the sharing of the story, you're going to realize it's not as bad as you thought.
Yeah.
But if you stay inside your head and recycle that story, it's going to sound worse and worse as you recycle it more and more. So that telling the story is therapeutic in lots of different ways for you as well as for other people, to help them with their perspective too.
Final thought for today's episode, and that is something that I've started doing. It's called a moment of gratitude. Who or what are you grateful for?
Oh, as I said earlier, all the different people. When I think about, there's a gentleman, James Elkins, when I was in a group home, who cooked pancakes every Saturday, and they were the best pancakes. So I would do anything to go back to have them. But as you can see, I've had my share of pancakes to get started. But I think, and if you ask my children, they would tell you, what can Daddy cook? It's pancakes, because of what James Elkins did. And there were so many people, like Mr. Elkins, who just gave something, small and meaningful to him, but was large and impactful to me. So it's all those people that are working in the foster care system, trying to make a difference. Mr. Elkins, was a sanitation worker during the week and worked in the group home on the weekend, so he never had a day off. And he was a Caucasian man working with Hispanic and Black, African American children, and we all gave him a very hard time because he looked like a hippie, and you just touched him on the side, he would fall to the floor. Very ticklish, but he was a good person. And so I think often we want to look at the stars, or who's the executive director, who the director is, but often it's just the staff there on a Saturday that's making a big difference. So it's Jim and all those other people that came to work and did what they could do in a small way, but also in a very, very large way.
Thank you. Thank
My
you so
pleasure.
much for
Thank
sharing
you.
and
My
being on the
pleasure.
show.